I'll still introduce myself. My name is Mamuka Tsereteli. I'm the head of America-Georgia Business Council. I'm also a senior fellow at Central Asia Caucasus Institute at American Foreign Policy Council. And I'm definitely a proud friend of Levan Mikeladze, late Ambassador Levan Mikeladze. It's already 10 years we continue this practice of hosting annual events on behalf of Levan Mikeladze Foundation in Washington, discussing policy issues and strategic issues that we are very close to the heart and mind of Ambassador Levan Mikeladze. And it's our now tradition to have this discussion about Georgia and Georgia neighborhood in Washington. There were a couple of occasions when our dear friend and our keynote speaker today, Fiona Hill, hosted this event in a similar event in the Brookings institution. It was, I think, 2013 or 2014, as I recall. But many other colleagues and friends attending these events, and we are very happy that we have a wonderful lineup of speakers today. And again, we'll discuss very important issues that we are close to Levan's heart and mind, but also are very important for country of Georgia. And we'll be discussing multiple facets of strategic evolving strategic environment in Eurasia and in Georgia neighborhood, and issues that are affecting not only Georgia but a pretty wider region around Georgia as well. Before we go to our main program, and I'll introduce program a little later, I would like to ask Tina to introduce Levan Mikeladze Foundation. We have two arms of this organization. One is in Georgia, represented by Achil Mikeladze. Another one is here in US, represented by Tina. Tina, please, floor is yours.
Hello, dear friends and conference participants. My name is Tina Mikeladze, and on behalf of our family and the foundation, we would like to thank you for participating in our conference. Special thanks to Mamuka for organizing this event with such a stellar panel of speakers. We are especially delighted to have Ms. Fiona Hill as a keynote speaker. In addition to being a prominent expert and a scholar, she was a friend of my father and someone he held with a lot of regard and respect. Thank you, Fiona, for your time and participation, but most importantly, for your continued support of Georgia and Georgians. There are a lot of interesting developments in Georgia and in the Caucasus region, and we look forward to hearing from all our participants and guests. Thanks again.
Thank you, Tina. Very briefly about program, we'll start with a keynote interview with Fiona Hill, and for about like 30, 40 minutes, then we'll have questions probably from panel participants. And then we'll move to our second panel, part of the discussion about how Georgia is adapting to new strategic realities around it. And this event will be closed by final closing remarks by Ambassador Levan Mikeladze. This is the plan. Before moving to Fiona with my questions, I wanted to just say that I think Eurasian continent is never static. Always something is happening, something is always changing there. And but last 2 years, on this backdrop of pandemic, two major events happened which affect Georgia greatly, in my opinion. One is definitely war in Karabakh and Azerbaijan returning its significant part of its territories by military means, and the changing environment in South Caucasus, which involved Russia, Turkey, and now involves other actors in the region as well, and all these new ideas about how South Caucasus security should be formed going forward. And second, I think maybe even more important globally, but definitely important for Georgia event, which is the developments in Afghanistan and what happened with the departure of US troops and return of Taliban to power, and how that impacted perception of US and partnership with the US, a partnership with Western institutions and Western allies in the region, because that's important. We are trying to understand, obviously, and look at perceptions not only from Washington or other capitals, but also from the regional perspective as well. So, very brief introduction of Ms. Fiona Hill. I'm sure she doesn't need any introduction to this audience here. But I think important element is that she's now traveling and presenting her book to different parts of United States. Her book is called "There is Nothing for You Here: Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century." And Fiona presents very interesting personal story in that book about her career, her obviously how she arrived to that career evolution and development. And I admit I haven't read book yet, but I'm looking forward to it. But Fiona spent many years in U.S. government, but also in academia and policy institutions like Brookings. Fiona and I met actually first time each other at Harvard University in late 90s when she hosted conference on Caspian energy development. And actually my first question relates to that. You know, at that time, we looked at this region, our region, Black Sea Caspian region, which I like to call it, as a very interesting place with lots of hopes and lots of expectations of both democracy development, economic evolution and prosperity growth, and build up of the sovereign statehoods of many different countries in the region. Participants of global international system. So my first question is, Fiona, how much of those hopes you think have materialized? Expectations of the both regional citizens and leadership and elites, as well as expectations from the West?
Well, thanks very much, Mamuka. I mean, that's a big question, obviously, and this is one of those times when we could really have done with Levan Mikeladze here, you know, to give us his wise counsel. You know, I often think, Tina, you know, back on my wonderful conversations with your father, often in, you know, the Georgian embassy when we were supposed to be having, you know, kind of a short meeting. It would go on for hours in which talking about these bigger issues. I mean, he's just somebody who had wonderful insights and great knowledge, and was just a wonderful person to talk to, and always came away from those discussions inspired, including by his great humanity and kindness. I'm just a wonderful person who's very sorely missed. And, you know, many of those conversations would actually focus on, you know, those expectations that we had. I think what all of us failed to realize, and look, it's right now, this is the anniversary of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The, you know, kind of collapse of a system that had been in place, you know, and obviously evolved out of, you know, Russia's imperial extension, but a system that had been in place for, you know, best part of, you know, 70 odd years. And, you know, I think we failed to really acknowledge and understand about how complicated it would be to unravel everything. You know, certainly for Russia, and look, we're facing another great crisis, Mamuka, you know, that is in your reach, on your doorstep for Georgia as well, is the threat now of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Russia's already invaded Ukraine, of course, into the Donbass, and the annexation of Crimea in 2014, you know, following on from the invasion of Georgia in 2008. But now the whole security of the Black Sea is put under question yet again. And, you know, we're in the midst of a pretty high level of diplomatic intervention to kind of see if we can head this off. But, you know, and it has its roots in those events of 30 years ago of Russia and the people who, you know, at the top of the Russian system right now, people like Vladimir Putin and those around him, are feeling a sense of loss. Putin frames it in the loss of an empire twice in the 20th century. It's a very 20th century view of everything. Loss with the end of the Russian Empire after the Bolshevik Revolution, and then a loss of the Soviet Union. Whereas for everyone else, Georgia included, this was again of a new perspective, again of an independence, but it was unraveling those ties, not just the political ties and the people-to-people ties, but the trade ties, the economic ties, and building something new that was so complicated. You, and perhaps I think we just underestimated the difficulty of doing so. You mentioned how we met at a discussion about Caspian energy and development of new pipelines, out of the region, new trade routes that, kind of were being manifested and symbolized by these pipelines. But it's the older patterns that have proven more difficult. And, as you're suggesting now, we've kind of reverted back, to much of the framing that we had, 30 years ago, or even earlier. Many of the manifestations of developments, you're saying, the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Well, of course, Russia looks now at the weakness, a potential weakness of the United States, based on its own remembrance of its own withdrawal from Afghanistan after a 10-year occupation, not a 20-year occupation, but that withdrawal at the end of the Soviet period was part of the unraveling of the Soviet Union. And a kind of lots of assumptions being made that the United States, in withdrawing from Afghanistan, is signaling its own unraveling, or its own kind of pulling back from international perspectives, but it's very much tied into domestic politics in the United States, just as it was in the Soviet period for the Soviet Union. And so I think there's a lot of assumptions being made that are also tied to Russian thinking about whether they should intervene or not in Ukraine. Is this a time of weakness of the United States? Would the United States not respond, for example? How would everybody else respond? Let's probe that. Is this like the Soviet withdrawal of Afghanistan? The other major issue of Nagorno-Karabakh, and you and everybody else here on this Zoom panel have been warning for years that those conflicts in the Caucasus were not frozen, that there was always a great risk of hot war because the war was simmering, that the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan and more broadly, in the region had never gone away, that there was no stasis there, just a phase, kind of in the next, could erupt at any time. We were always arguing with the Azeris that there was no military solution. They definitively pushed back and showed that there was a military solution. And of course, it's because things changed with the advent of the energy pipelines and development of oil and gas in the Caspian. For Azerbaijan, their main investment was in a military buildup. But the technological aspects of this are also very interesting, because what was probably the decisive element in the most recent round of war was drones, technology developed by Turkey. And this is just something that I want to, press upon as well. You can't escape, despite forward-looking, advantage your geography and history. And what we're seeing as a result of Nagorno-Karabakh and the outbreak of war again, Azerbaijan, using military force, as you pointed out, Mamuka, to gain things that had not been able to in its view through diplomacy. We've brought back the old empires into the mix. Both Armenia and Azerbaijan had wanted to escape the clutches of the old imperial perspective. Armenia, despite having a close military association with Russia, which actually did not guarantee its security in this point, at this particular juncture from Armenia's point of view, had also wanted to have different associations. Association with the European Union, for example, it got pushed back from. Also a forward-looking perspective. Prime Minister Pashinyan was moving around, trying to, find, a different perspective for Armenia, and finding this extraordinarily difficult, being limited, in the kind of relationships by all of the older relationships and the old patterns. Azerbaijan, despite of all of its kind of pushing out of a new perspective of trade and energy and links with Greece and Italy and, moving out towards Europe and a bigger presence here in the United States, was still kind of bogged down in its kind of thinking about regional dynamics. And the war has brought the three countries of Iran, Turkey and Russia, the old imperial powers, well and truly back into the region. And I know that this is, one issue that you have been thinking about in a major way. And so I think, as getting back to the answer to the question, that we completely underestimated the difficulty of unraveling from an entrenched system. And we also couldn't escape, the prison in some respects of history and geography. And so, kind of all of the kind of thinking for the future, which George has been engaged in as a very progressive force within the Caucasus, there's always been constrained. And so, where our expectations were, perhaps too high, was just in not realizing and understanding fully all the constraints that we're operating under. I personally think that George has achieved a great deal, in this time frame. And Georgia, kind of putting aside Armenia and Azerbaijan, that, the case of Azerbaijan still been very much focused on reclaiming Nagorno-Karabakh instead of really kind of thinking, outside the box and doing things, kind of differently. I mean, for understandable reasons from Azerbaijan's perspective. Georgia has managed to, I think, establish, for the first time, not just an independence, but a different perspective and a different set of relationships within the region and more broadly. And there's still a lot of potential for that, notwithstanding a lot of the political polarization we see in Georgia today and some of the problems.
Okay, I think definitely you provoked some other questions, but I'll try to focus on one important, I think, element. I just remembered that exactly 22 years ago, it was November of 1999, when Istanbul summit of OSCE was held, where Levan played very important role in organization and achievements that Georgia had on withdrawal agreements on withdrawal of Russian troops and some other obviously important issues related to energy and pipelines and so forth. So we are talking about OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. 22 years passed from that very significant for Georgian history event, and many things happened obviously in those years, including fact that Helsinki Agreement and Helsinki Principles, which even Soviet Union agreed to, is somehow no longer respected or honored by current Russian leadership. And where it brings actually importance of or significance or even value of OSCE anymore. And I think it's also puts us in it's a broader question about what is the value of international organizations anymore, unless they are really security organizations with collective security principles. So my question is really, is there any hope for OSCE to really revitalize itself and find the right place and play some role in European security and European Eurasian security affairs? And being on a very serious position, very senior position at National Security Council, obviously you dealt with OSCE as well. And what's your perspective on this? Any future for organizations like OSCE? I mean, at this point, exactly specifically on OSCE.
Look, I think the principles of the OSCE still hold and the aspirations that we had for it. So, there's always there, I think, an opportunity to try to revitalize that whole set of principles and to, kind of frame things in that context. Right now we're deliberating as a result of all of this pressure and threats that Putin and Russia have been putting on Ukraine. The idea of reopening up again, I mean, we've already been talking about it for many years in any case about how to formulate this whole issue about European security. And of course, every time we do that, it comes back one way or another to the same idea of OSCE, of framing things in a larger entity, because you cannot, as President Biden has just said to Putin in this video call, have other countries questioning the independence, sovereignty, integrity, and choices of another. And OSCE was intended to give smaller states an equal say, an equal voice, not just to be, although it's headquartered in Vienna, it's not supposed to be the Congress of Vienna, which seems to be more of a preference for Russia of, a couple of hundred years, plus ago, of the big countries making the decisions over the heads of everyone else and at the expense of, smaller countries. I do want to say, though, that 1999, was quite a fraught year. It wasn't just the turn of the millennium that brought us Vladimir Putin, who's been president ever since. But of course, there were an awful lot of things that were supposed to happen and then didn't happen. And then some things that happened that put things in a different light. One was, of course, that was also, against that backdrop of the Istanbul summit, a lot of opening of expectations that Turkey might join the European Union. And of course, it hasn't. And, all that promise and thoughts of Turkey, that would have really recast all of the politics and dynamics in the Caucasus if Turkey had, and if that had been successful. But it was also that period when Russia decides that NATO is a massive threat, because it's the bombing of Belgrade, because of the wars in the Balkans and the atrocities that Serbia was carrying out in Kosovo. And that's kind of a moment when everybody in Russia, everybody, I mean, I was happened to be there at a conference at the time, and even the most, kind of Western-leaning Russian politicians were shocked by that. And it's at that point that they all decide that NATO is just in the same old business of being a military alliance targeted against them, because they start to think through. And of course, that's the language that we hear from Putin today, that NATO could be used against Russia in a similar kind of localized conflict. And, kind of Putin is beginning his rise to the presidency at that point. He's the head of the FSB, the, kind of successor to the KGB, and he starts to, kind of frame his whole viewpoints of the United States, NATO, and the alliance in that point. And of course, has, made it very clear ever since to Georgia, Ukraine, and other countries that NATO is a no-go. And that continues to be the problem. And, as I said, then we get back to, again, the OSCE. As, again, the mechanism that tries to address all of these issues about mutual security in different ways, economic elements to it, as well as energy and all aspects, related to security, becoming, inescapable, the only real formulation that might work. But the problem is, is that seen as sufficiently as a mechanism, given all of the different problems we have in the OSCE context, to resolve many of the outstanding issues? And I think when we've seen, Azerbaijan's resort to military force for the resolution on its terms of what happened in Karabakh, then the introduction not of OSCE observers, but of Russian peacekeepers, something that Russia's been pushing for ever since, the outbreak of war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Then we see a kind of a whole different interpretation of this. Personally, I think we should still keep pushing for that. I think the OSCE and that general formulation is really the only approach that we can take to broader European security that will also factor in the concerns of Georgia, Ukraine, you name it.
Yeah, I think that's definitely your point about, smaller states having say in the European affairs was definitely one of the priorities at that time. And remember how actually Guam group was actually formed because of 4 countries, actually Georgia, Azerbaijan, Ukraine, and Moldova, could resist to broad agreement until their demands or their requests were met by larger powers. I remember Levan's conversation with the U.S. ambassador at that time, and leadership that Georgia had some say because it was consensus-based organization, and it is still a consensus-based organization. But in order for this to be really functional, I think, and that's which we cannot escape, is that large powers should respect this organization. And I think it's in their interest as well in many ways. And issues like conflict in Ukraine and others could be resolved much easier through the framework of organizations like this, if they're functional and if their decisions are respected. I would like to go back to Russian perceptions. And this is, I think, very important issue, because sometimes from Washington or European capitals, we discuss how we think Russians may look to this or another issue, but sometimes we forget that there are perceptions in Russia, even if they are not based on facts. They are perceptions, and perceptions transformed into facts for those people who have those perceptions. So their understanding of what NATO is doing, let's say in Black Sea or Ukraine or in Georgia or other places, is definitely for them it's a reality. It's not factual or anything like that. But my question is about Russia. And a lot of people say about Russia declining power, Russia being it's a show of weakness. Let's say Russia accepting Turkish role in Karabakh being a sign of weakness of Russia. I personally look at this issue a slightly different way. I mean, Russia may be weaker than it was during the Soviet high times of Soviet Union, but I mean, Russia had many periods in its history of temporary decline, but coming back as a significant power again. So my question is, what do you think about future of Russia? And I'm sure it has many different sort of facets, and it's a large question. But looking from the perspective of South Caucasus, obviously Russia will continue to play a significant role in affairs of South Caucasus. Where you see Russian role evolving going forward, in the, having in mind what happened in Karabakh and Russian role in Karabakh?
Yeah, look, I think there's some really interesting things that you've said there, Mamuka, and I was very interested in reading the Kremlin's readout yesterday of the Biden-Putin call. I'm sure other people looked at it as well. It was almost a kind of a transcript sort of approach in which they tried to embed some of their main points. And there was one word that I saw was kind of not well translated into English, which was the word asfait. It was kind of used by the Kremlin, obviously pretty deliberately, to try to describe, this gets to your point about perceptions, about what they thought that NATO was doing in Ukraine. They said that Ukraine, NATO was trying to, and then the use of the word asfait, which was described as conquer, which is ridiculous. That's not it.
Assimilate, yeah, to incorporate.
Incorporate and assimilate. And actually, that's the word, I'm being a very boring, linguist here, that the Russians used about what they do to Siberia. It's освоение Sibir. I read a book about that at one point. So it's a very deliberately, used word, which is, it's something difficult and hard to swallow that you try to kind of, make your own over a kind of a period of time. It's not something that happens, abruptly. And, so it's kind of indicative of, this sort of creeping, influence that they see of the West. But it's really, of course, it's not kind of we're creeping in, from the Western perspective. It's Ukraine wanting to, engage and, have these relations, which is the same, for, Georgia and, the rest of the Caucasus. But that's the same kind of, it's that the core of the word is svoi, yours, mine, ours, kind of thing. It's kind of Russia sees everything it's ours and doesn't, and any other development, any other relationship is somebody else trying to make it ours. It just gets to that whole point of seeing Georgia, Ukraine, and other countries as not being fully independent and sovereign and not having agency and their own kind of right to determine, their own place. Because the svoi actually should be you, Georgia, should be Ukraine, making, yourselves whole, kind of all about yourselves, your own perspectives. And that's really the big problem that we have here. Any effort, to kind of, for Georgia to forge new relationships that go beyond, the kind of immediate region, historic, geographic patterns, kind of say, let's say a trade deal with Australia, kind of a larger, relationship with Canada, Mexico, kind of going much further afield, will somehow be always viewed as suspicion of a kind of a, Georgian effort to sort of break out in some way and not be something that's done by your own agency and, by your own kind of desires and design. Because it always kind of, I think back to not something Levan said, but something that Alex Rondelli, another, kind of lost great Georgian thinker once said to me. He said, you've got to understand, Fiona, that Russia doesn't see us as countries, it sees us as shadows, a shadow cast by Russia. So this remains the problem, how to make, Georgia real, to everyone else, not the, the victim of others' perceptions. How to make, Georgia from that Russian perspective svoi, yours, your own. And that's the challenge. And you'll be constantly trying to kind of find, kind of way out of this. And it gets to something you were kind of saying at the very beginning about the Russian, not just the perception, but the goal. They want the creation of a new order in which it's recognized that everybody else is a shadow cast by them, a sphere of influence, a satellite, however we want to talk about it, but that Russia's suzerainty extends, kind of a much broader area. They don't necessarily want peace and a resolution of all of the issues in the region because those are leverage. And the order is really to constrain others, to keep them out and then allow Russia a free hand inside. So it's not peace. It's not a resolution of conflict. Whatever they're suggesting now for Nagorno-Karabakh, talk about opening up the border between Turkey and Armenia is a sort of a gift to Armenia. Kind of a resolution, more talks on Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan that are brokered by Russia is meant to retain leverage. And so that, I think is, kind of the part of the problem, which goes back again to really the only formulation being really one of the OSCE. And as you said before, we have to then have the major powers within the OSCE to actually affirm it, to kind of not just try to use it as a tool, kind of when, kind of they're out of options or out of ideas for, how to kind of engage in a bilateral or, small group multilateral level.
Yeah, I think this perception issue is definitely important and frequently underappreciated in many aspects, but this is a longer conversation, I think, and we need to understand better sort of what is that Russia sort of sees. There are elements of looking at different countries around Russia as shadows, as you mentioned, but I think even that is changing. I mean, it's not the same as it was, let's say, 20 years ago.
Right.
They understand that these countries are now capable of doing certain things. They want to somehow prove that these are incapable countries to run their own affairs, but there are many things that look much better in Georgia than in Russia right now, whether it's corruption issue and some other issues. So I think even that perception is probably somewhat changed. But I think one important and underlying element remains there. Even you probably recall in early 2000s, there was this first time in Russian foreign policy doctrine, it was indicated that Russia considers borders of former Soviet Union as a strategic borders of Russia, which means that there shouldn't be any military forces inside of borders of former Soviet Union. And even if you recall, there was this book by Dmitry Trenin about evolution of Russian borders, which was an interesting book, and how Russia sees these borders as why Russia sees these strategic borders and buffer sort of territories important for its own security. I think understanding is important for us, all of us who care obviously for our own interests, but in order to advance our own interests, I think it's important for us to understand what Russians think about this. One further question I had about Turkey. We had many conversations about Turkey. I remember you brought some of your colleagues to Tbilisi once, and we talked about Turkey-Georgia relationships a lot. And we see Turkey kind of evolving and changing its regional position. It managed to build. I was skeptical, frankly, several years ago that Turkey will manage to build its own center of gravity, but it managed to do that, and it plays much larger role in South Caucasus as well. I mean, obviously for Georgia it was always important, but even for other countries now it's for Georgia and Azerbaijan. But for all the neighborhood, it's becoming more and more serious actor. And that brings us to Armenia-Turkish relationship issue, which is also important because if Armenia somehow resolves its problems with Turkey, then South Caucasus looks very different than it is now. So what do you think about prospects of Armenia-Turkish?
Well, again, it depends on whose terms, because I mean, the most recent press things I've seen about that has been Russia broaching that idea. So, obviously Russia and Turkey are engaged in, let's just say, some rather complex sets of interactions that, as you said, kind of often evolve and look different from different perspectives. In Syria now, in Libya, there's, that, again, the whole framing of history of a kind of Russo-Turkish standoffs and engagement in all kinds of old stomping grounds. There's also Turkey's supplying Ukraine with drones, which actually might be one of the proximate causes recently of, kind of Russia's, violent reaction or prospective violent reaction, because of course Turkey is still a major NATO member, though sometimes people forget. And Turkey technically is not just part of NATO, but is also kind of part of the European space. And as I mentioned earlier, it would have been a lot different for Georgia, I think, if Turkey had indeed succeeded in acceding to the European Union. We'd be having a very different conversation, because that would have had a really major influence on Georgia. It would have made it much more possible for you to have had the open association, with the European Union that, of course, managed to achieve, which has been, kind of very important for Georgia. But it would have given it a much greater depth. And of course, it might have also, pulled your neighbours, kind of a bit more closely in a different direction. But I think Turkey and Russia are kind of tussling for the Black Sea now, and of course Turkey's taken a pretty strong stance in a rather negative way in the Eastern Mediterranean, not just in the long-standing disputes with Greece, but now about energy development. Although I mean that's kind of faded a little bit to the background in recent times, but we've had a lot of standoffs over developments of energy resources in Cyprus. Turkey trying to play a bit of a spoiler role in the further development, of energy in Israel, Egypt, and elsewhere. Not in the ways that we might have intended. And of course, Turkey, there's a lot of complexity there because there's Erdogan. And then there's, kind of a whole host of other actors. We tend to get fixated on Erdogan and his views, the neo-Ottomanism of his perspective, which has shaped a lot of these interactions with Russia, for example. But as you said, there are close relations between Georgia and the Turkish military. And there's also a lot of trade. And the Turkish business sector is multifaceted as well. It's not just the state-dominated sector, but the private sector. There are a lot of actors in the Turkish business field. Some of the people that I brought, to meet with you were from TÜSİAD, not just from TOB, the big trade organization. They've got very different views on how Turkey should position itself, what the future of Turkey should be. There's a younger generation that wants to be much more integrated. A lot of, younger Turks who have an affinity, historic and familial with Georgia, for example, a lot of tourism, all the things that we've seen that have emerged there. So there's a lot of promise. It's just that, right now we're kind of stuck in this old framing, and the Turkey-Russia relationship has become complex. So if, as there has been a push from inside of Turkey to open up the border with Armenia, the proximate cause of the closure of that border, the occupation by Armenia of Azeri territory, has been removed by Azerbaijan's military action and Turkey's assistance to that. I mean, a lot of people are saying behind the scenes, and even somewhat publicly in the Turkish press, well, hang on, we broke off the protocols with Armenia. We didn't move forward with opening the border because of the continued occupation of Azeri territory by Armenia. So that's gone now. But the difficulty is, does this now get brokered seemingly as a gift to Armenia by Russia? Because, Russia really kind of presided over the clobbering of Armenia by Azerbaijan. It did not restrain Azerbaijan. I don't think this was a sign of weakness at all, actually. I think this was a message to Armenia and a message to others that, kind of, if you don't toe the line, because there was a lot of pressure on Pashinyan in Armenia from Russia about, kind of independent behavior and independent perspective. But if you don't toe the line, either we'll teach you a lesson or somebody else will be allowed to teach you a lesson. And I think that was a kind of rather blunt kind of perspective that was offered. And now, kind of Russia's there as peacekeepers in Nagorno-Karabakh. It's Russia that's, kind of pushing forward with all of the, the infrastructure and communications ties. It's Russia that's certainly trying to orchestrate whatever happens next. And I think that's kind of obviously something that we should be trying to avoid.
Yeah, this perception that Russia is bluffing, there are elements of that for sure. But when you see to results of last 15 years of Russia's strategic position vis-a-vis, at least with neighbors and with the larger powers as well, I think probably stronger than it used to be. So, but that's again a very large subject. Now I would like to focus on Georgia. Next question, and maybe combine a couple of things. First of all, is that, there is definitely growing frustration in Georgia that, we do everything right. We fought all the wars with American troops. We pursue some of the policies that the European Union suggests to us in order to be integrated in European economic space, which are sometimes not always favorable to Georgia's, let's say, business interests and so forth. But the prospects of Georgia being integrated into European structures are okay. There are some advancements, but not rapid enough to satisfy maybe needs of Georgia, and particularly on security side, definitely is most important, the most pressing. On the other hand, you see Azerbaijan made some kind of deal with Russia and advanced its interests, made its territorial sort of return of those occupied territories, and beyond that in Karabakh, some of these lands are back to Azerbaijani control. And what type of signal does it send to in a neighborhood that if you deal with Russia, you can achieve some of your goals, and if you don't deal with Russia, then you are where you are in terms of your security, and a kind of questionable sort of position. And of course, this 3+3 initiative, which Russia and Turkey and Iran strongly support, and which Azerbaijan is also more enthusiastic. Armenia is less enthusiastic, and Georgia doesn't want to be part of it at this stage because of the obvious reasons with the relationship with Russia and occupation of territories and military presence and so forth. But this pressure on Georgia will increase, will only increase. And so this is the dilemma that whether we talk about that loudly or not, I think I can talk about that loudly, and I think it's important for us to discuss this issue, is that, so what is there for Georgia going forward? Should Georgia think more about balancing its foreign relationship and its foreign policy, or should it stick with the course that it had before, and but be cautious, obviously, with the neighbors, but not to antagonize or escalate relationship with Russia, but at the same time avoid any compromises on some of the regional affairs? We should realize that there will be increasing pressure coming from partner countries as well, like Turkey and Azerbaijan, for Georgia to become some kind of player in this 3+3. It has its interesting element. Sorry, my question is long, but I would like you to think or comment on that as well. It doesn't say Russian narrative doesn't say anything about two other so-called states that they recognize as state, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, they no longer exist. So, which somehow I see it as a signal as well. You know, even they don't see them as a definitely independent states. Even Russians don't see them as an independent state. But so where you see sort of Georgia should be in this very delicate but already very difficult issue of managing now regional partnership and neighborhood policies.
Well, look, first of all, I think you're spot on with the assessment. I think that's exactly what's happening, how it's being framed, and that signaling, is clear. It's also across the Black Sea with Moldova and Transnistria, something very similar is happening. There's kind of obviously an effort there to, kind of message the Moldovans that, if you kind of play ball with us and don't keep going along this kind of path that you're already on with the new government, that we can resolve Transnistria. And obviously that always remains as a leverage. And, I think that's kind of very clear. I mean, I think, as you said, the absence of discussion of Abkhazia and South Ossetia is notable. It's deliberate. And, I think we're seeing the framing in this regard. So look, I think, you've got a couple of things here. First of all, Belarus, not where Belarus is now, but some time ago, before Alexander Lukashenko's attempts to kind of just keep on staying in the presidency forever, was flirting with a kind of a whole idea of going off in a different direction, even though, the constraints on Belarus were even greater by being part of a formal union agreement with Russia. But Lukashenko was trying to play off with, closer association with Europe. I mean, I was in the government of the NSC, and the Belarusians coming to us all the time, opening up the idea of, the embassy again. We appointed an ambassador, Julie Fisher, to Minsk. Somebody's familiar to many people in Georgia through her past roles. They were wanting to host the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development annual conference. I guess that won't be happening now. All kinds of different things. But ultimately, it came down for Lukashenko about his own personal power, the domestic politics. So that's just a kind of a warning sign for everyone in the region as well. And, this is what happened, of course, in Armenia with Pashinyan not being able to kind of bridge those political divides. Georgia's pretty polarized politically right now. That is the perfect cleavage and opportunity, for Russia to play in. It's exactly how Russia had so much of an influence in the United States in 2016, our polarization, partisan infighting, our loss of perspective of ourselves as Americans, divisions into, kind of sides versus each other. Everything that's going on in Georgia right now, domestically, politically, makes you vulnerable. So I would say, as a first matter, figure out how to overcome that. I mean, the people here on this Zoom call, are people who are dedicated to Georgia, to Georgians, to kind of like a common perspective and a common concept. You have a lot of skill and experience in that. You need to, kind of basically get your own house in order as well simultaneously. The second thing is, kind of Russia obviously gets triggered by institutional issues, kind of when Georgia's or Ukraine or anybody else is trying to make a big push as Armenia did also, for an association. You've already got past that association hurdle, with the EU. Start to focus, and as I know you have been, on other key relationships with European countries and others, kind of more broadly, and building those up, over time, breaking out of that confines of just a regional perspective. Georgia's got a lot more relationships, a lot more to offer. I know you've been thinking not just about Turkey, but about Greece, Italy, Israel, all the countries where you have some connections, historic and present, and building those up. Because the EU itself, just like NATO, is in a difficult period. I mean, the EU's had Brexit. There's still seeing these spats going on between the French and the British, even though they're supposedly in mutual defence agreements that are separate from whatever was within the EU, but also within NATO. I mean, so actually Georgia's got very good relationship with France and the UK independently. Be building up those relationships with Germany, where you've put an awful lot of emphasis. And, I think, Europe's having a very hard time in figuring out enlargement, given the fact that it's, going through a divorce, which is kind of painful and unpleasant. And, there are children, already at stake, like Ireland and the Northern Ireland and the whole issues of those borders. Keeping a very close eye on how those issues are going to be resolved, I think would be very important for Georgia to get some kind of signalling and ideas itself of how to move forward in some of these relationships. And certainly with NATO, while there is this standoff with Russia on Ukraine, because Georgia and Ukraine tied yourselves together, whether you intended to or not, with the joint appeal for a map going back to Bucharest in 2008, you're going to have to take that extraordinarily carefully. So, again, that general perspective of being, not trapped in a framework that others are trying to impose on you, being very well aware it's there, being very aware of the signaling, but how you can try to build up the other assets that you have there, because Georgia has achieved an enormous amount in 30 years, But first of all, you've got to get back to that initial achievement of Georgian independence and being Georgians, that kind of common sense of being part of one polity. Even if people have different identities, everybody has within Europe as well, it's the same thing, but trying to kind of pull together as a polity, as a political entity, as a state, as a country. Even again, there might be competing identities within that political, ethnic, linguistic, etc. But you've really got to put that uppermost as we move on into this next phase.
I think that's the most difficult part for us, probably, because it's like here in the United States, people live in parallel realities, and one group lives in one reality, another group another reality, and unfortunately. But I don't want to go there. It's not our subject of conversation. It's probably a separate conversation that we need to have going forward in the future. How Georgia can consolidate itself internally in order to deal with the external threat that is facing and external challenges. Now, I think I exhausted my personal time as an interviewer, and I would like to ask now our panel participants if they have any questions or comments while we have you here on the with us. So if you could, what I would like to do is that restrict our panel participants for just maybe 1 minute, 1.5 minute comment or question, if you have a question to Fiona. Anybody who wants to start, you're welcome to start. So
I think we've got Yulia there, right? I see a hand, yeah. Hi.
Hi, and thank you so much for the remarks. I've learned a lot. I have two questions coming from different perspectives. One is related to, I really valued your comments regarding Georgia in the regional context, and how it should navigate with care, but also try to, just your last points, try to anchor itself into the region. I'm Romanian myself. I work a lot on Georgia with Mamuka. And so that's always the advice that I give too, but I would be curious to learn from you what it can do concretely in the context of Ukraine, the Ukrainian crisis right now, caused by Russia, obviously, in terms of making a difference with the small role it can have as a small country, and being a bit sidelined from the mainstream Black Sea issues right now. And then the other thing is, how can Georgia think about if you want, benefit from the increased attention that we have now in the West on the region in terms of getting more support from its Western partners, particularly the United States. And then the other thing that I want to take advantage and ask you is in terms of the observations that you made of Russians trying continuously over the last 30 years to incorporate the former Soviet Union, including with clear measures like passportization, borderization, and then so much more. When we're looking at the vulnerability, for instance, of Georgia to malign influence, it's just as reduced as countries like Romania in the region who joined the EU and joined NATO. So looking from the other perspective, this is a question that I tackle. I teach also European security at Georgetown, and students ask me that a lot, so I'd love to learn from you. Can we think, do you believe that we're dealing in the region, particularly the Black Sea, the extended Black Sea region, that in many Western European minds and capitals, unfortunately, is not as well segmented or consolidated into what Europe means? Can we think about the European influence, major powers and the institutions of the European Union as sort of having failed to incorporate Georgia and the entire Black Sea space more into the Western framework and hence build more security? Do you think of it in that way, or how are we supposed to be thinking about these things? Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks, Julia. I think those two things I can tie together, because I do think that we have had a failure to really focus on the Black Sea. And I think Mamuka's and many others here, Achille and, David, Stephen, many people have been thinking about this, of course, for a very long time. We had Charles King write a whole book about this, as a historian. And we just seem to have failed to spark a consistent and coherent approach and interest in the Black Sea region. The Baltic Sea and the Baltic states and others have, tended to fixate or fix, I would say, the kind of the discussions over European security. When there was the discussion example of the Three Seas initiative, the Black Sea wasn't even, kind of fully factored in terms of thinking about infrastructure development and connectivity. I think we're now seeing an awful lot more focus on the Black Sea, but as a result and a reaction to, Russia's more aggressive posture after the annexation of Crimea, and in fact, its question about freedom of navigation, particularly after the seizure of the Kerch Strait. And the soldiers they're building the Kerch Strait Bridge, the sort of already evident declaration of the Sea of Azov as a Russian sea, Mariupol, the major Ukrainian ports are there. I think that's also part of the perspective of the pressure that Russia is kind of putting on Ukraine at this moment. And I do think that we need to have a comprehensive and multifaceted approach to thinking about the Black Sea. When I was at the NSC, we did actually try to put that on the agenda for not just NATO, but for other meetings. And I think, a more active role by Romania and others, Bulgaria, there's been some back and forth on this in Bulgarian political circles, but that might then provide a portal for Georgia to have a whole series of different strategic and practical discussions with other European players. There's the maritime aspect of NATO, for example, MARCOM. They've had a very different perspective of how, freedom of navigation in the high seas is not just the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea, but, kind of much more broadly. There's the merchant marine aspect of this. There's an awful lot of commercial shipping in the Black Sea, including to Georgian Black Sea ports as well as Romanian. Some of the world's largest ports are in and around the Black Sea and in the Eastern Mediterranean. So there could be another approach to this of talking, with the larger international owners of shipping fleets, for example, about, kind of freedom of navigation in the Black Sea for trade and economic purposes. I mean, we tried to instigate that in the reaction to the Kerch Strait, because, here was Russia denying entry to the Kerch Straits to Ukrainian shipping, even though there are an awful lot of Russian commercial ports, not just military, ports in the Sea of Azov and, throughout the Black Sea. But, we really see Russia trying to kind of put in question the Black Sea as part of an international, maritime space. And of course, that has knock-on effects, not just for the region we're talking about, but for the Indo-Pacific as well as the Arctic, the Antarctic. There's all kind of the high seas. And part of the problem is, of course, the United States has never signed the UN's, kind of convention on the law of the sea, which is big of a problem. But other countries and Georgia, that can start to push this forward. So I think it gets, from that to the first part of your question, there could be a lot of creativity here for Georgia to engage itself more broadly, and for other countries to engage with Georgia more broadly on some of these issues, not just doing it through the military lens or the institutional lens, but about how could we have a broader discussion about the Black Sea and the Black Sea region, which Georgia is part of that. And I mean, again, that gets back to my earlier recommendation of Georgia really prioritizing some of key relationships with Romania, for example, with countries that you have historic ties with as well, and sort of legacies and diasporas. Poland, for example, pushing for participation in the 3 Cs and infrastructure initiatives. I mean, I know that was part of the whole planning for the development of the port and, kind of the deep water port, for example, but really being very systematic and strategic about this. Italy, kind of thinking about how you build up in the relationships that you've already started to nurture over the past 30 years. And I think, countries like Romania, those that are concerned about the future of the Black Sea, could be playing a role here. And, kind of pushing other Europeans, which I think they're already ready for, particularly in with this backdrop of this continued pressure on Ukraine to take a more serious look at the Black Sea region writ large.
So broadening bilateral relationship that would build a balancing kind of factors in survival strategy of Georgia would be definitely something advisable. Stephen, you had, I think, question or comment.
Your comment as well.
Hi, Fiona. Greetings from a compatriot. Thanks so much for your wonderful discussion of the issues. And I was particularly intrigued by your unpacking of the Turkish-Georgian relationship, for example, and how multifaceted it is, and how we should not be simply concentrating on the relationship between central governments. And also this whole question of Georgia, expanding its relationships with other countries that don't maybe normally fall into its major focus, right? So, I mean, the Eastern European, what we now call Eastern European, perhaps, or Central European countries like Poland, as you say, and the Baltic republics are definitely relationships that should be focused on and developed, where there's already long-standing sympathy for Georgia's position. But I actually want to ask you about Putin, in the sense, and going back to Mamuka's question of this sense of reality and what Putin's reality is right now. I mean, we can all remember Putin in the early 2000s as a rather pragmatic and clever Machiavellian figure, right? Who before the Munich Security Conference had rather pragmatic and cooperative attitude towards the West. He's clearly evolved, if that's the right word. And I'm just wondering, what is if you could sort of unpack like you did with Turkey, the sort of complex relationships that Georgia has with Russia, and put Putin in there somewhere. Has he moved from that sort of pragmatic, clever Machiavellian position to somebody now who has really become, enclosed in his own perception of rather with traditional sort of Russian chauvinism, the idea of this, what do we call, what's the word for it? Fear of foreigners.
Xenophobia kind of.
Xenophobia, right. So, I mean, is that where the reality for Putin is now? Is he really there? Or do you think that that cleverness and sense of that very important strategic sense that he has is still sort of a balance to this more sort of chauvinistic position that he's taken in recent years?
Yeah, look, I think there's kind of different aspects to this, right? I think if you look more globally outside of the region, there's still a lot of evidence of that. You know, the Russians, and he has also been very clever at doing what I was just advocating for Georgia, looking around the world where they have assets, old relationships, and you know, kind of trying to position Russia to be a global player, or reposition Russia as a global player, not just sticking to the old Soviet legacy, but, you know, kind of thinking where is the future, and it's obviously in the Indo-Pacific region. I mean, I just remember a little kind of vignette that I'll you know, kind of share here, that when I was in a meeting in my role in the NSC between Trump and Putin said something about Russia's border with North Korea, and Trump went, "What? You have a border with North Korea?" And, you know, it's just like, well, it's hard to see on the map, right? And if you've not been looking at maps, probably you wouldn't have noticed it. But, you know, you saw Putin immediately bristle, that whole idea of not being a player, you know, in a much larger sense. And obviously you can see a lot of strategic thinking now about how best to position Russia on outside of, you know, this particular region on a more global basis. So I do think that more strategic Machiavellian, you know, the visit to India, you know, most of that time spent with Xi, crafting that strategic partnership with China, making sure that you're not going to be left behind, trying to create the sense of a world in which it's China number one, and then Russia, you know, hopefully behind, and then the United States is kind of the foil, but a sort of a three-way, you know, kind of game here, or tournament that Putin wants to make sure they're a major player in. But when you get closer to home, I think, you know, what you're talking about here, closer to home, of kind of his mental frame of home, his mental map of the world that is emotional and personal,
Right.
then I think you're starting to see something else going on. And part of that is legacy, you know, kind of he has and started, I think, you know, quite some time ago to been thinking of himself as indispensable within the Russian state. I mean, it's been a long time since people around him were saying there's no Russia without Putin. You know, that obsession with being, you know, the heir of the czars, not just of, you know, the kind of Soviet leaders, idea of longevity. I mean, you know, why is he propping up Lukashenko? In part because Lukashenko's been around longer than he has. You know, why is he deferring now, you know, to Biden in a way? Before he was insulting him about age, because, you know, if he hangs around until 2036, he'll be 84, you know, and Biden's only, what, 78? That's another 6 years on, you know, kind of, so he, you know, if he's sort of presenting Biden as somehow not with it, what's he going to be like, you know, at 84 would be the question. You know, trying to get beyond all of these you know, issues about the questions about how long he's there. It's all about his power, staying in power, or is it his power to dictate what happens next, to protect himself and the system that he's built around him, not just the system of the state, but the people and others who are dependent upon him and who he's dependent upon. And then the question of his legacy, how is he going to be remembered? And he would have been remembered in very different ways at different times, right? Because he's been there for 21, coming into his 22nd year now. You know, he came to us at the turn of the millennium. And, you know, if he'd left after he'd handed over to Dmitry Medvedev, we might have been pretty positive about him, you know, notwithstanding war in Chechnya and other things, but, you know, could put Russia back on its feet. You know, kind of it made the state solvent, it strengthened the state again. But the annexation of Crimea in particular puts Russia in a very different place. And the whole speech that he gave of the annexation, which I passed endlessly, you know, it's a speech that came right out of, you know, the era of the Tsars. It was kind of, you know, the Catherine the Great speech. And after that, he starts to put himself into that perspective. He can't play that around the world, but he's playing it closer to home. And that's when everybody else's independence becomes an affront. Because if he's indeed the Tsar, and his mental map of the world is still the map of the Russian Empire as he steeps himself in history, or the Soviet Union, then he can't really conceive of anything in a different place. He's no longer in the 21st century, even though he's the president of the 21st century, has many of the styles and attributes of a 21st century figure, but he's the kind of the person of the past. The legacy is all rooted in being, you know, the heir to Prince, you know, kind of Vladimir, the Grand Prince of, not just Kiev, but, you know, kind of Crimea, you know, kind of that whole myth making about Russia and Ukraine and Crimea all being one and tangled together. It's the mything of him being the heir to all of the statuary of the former Tsars that he has around in the big meeting room that I've been into many times and noticed Nicholas I, Alexander, you know, the Great, Catherine the Great, you know, kind of arranged around so we can kind of look at them, you know, to probably gain inspiration at the appropriate moment. You know, when he mentioned Crimea to us, he looked towards Catherine, you know, Peter the Great. I mean, it's kind of how he sees himself and his legacy there, I think, is problematic. And that's where he kind of falls into that category that you're describing there. So I think we're dealing with, multiple Putins, because he is still canny and savvy and strategic, and he's a contingency planner. He, is the guy who learned all the dirty tricks in the KGB and knows how to apply them in certain settings. But he's also this person who sees himself as wrapped up in the history and the legacy of the Russian state. And kind of George's independence, everybody else's is an affront.
Okay.
Yeah, I think. Thank you, Stephen. Before I turn to Archil, I think I would just wanted to comment that in a sense, Putin was allowed to make this evolution and arrive to a position where he is now, from recognition of independence of Georgian separatist regions and what happened in 2008.
Right. That
would lead to 2014 sooner or later, but we didn't pay attention, meaning we combined Western sort of world looking at former Soviet Union space, but also in many ways 2007, 2006, 2005, all this conversation about recognition of Kosovo's independence, where it may lead, and those. I mean, I know there are different understandings of that process, but I personally believe that somehow led him to, on one hand, his perceptions, but also his reaction to those perceptions and his actions in Georgia and so forth led to other things. And I think that's something that there is definitely clear linkage, which we disregarded, Washington disregarded, Europe disregarded, others disregarded. And so we are where we are today. Archil,
I
your comment.
completely agree with you, by the way. I completely agree that was really the threshold, because he moved from threatening, in Munich in 2007 to actually action. He overcame that threshold. And in, the West, it was kind of blamed on personal, antipathy toward Saakashvili. And of course, that's all still playing out in all kinds of various ways. But it was really about more than that. And people failed to recognize it. Absolutely.
Jill.
Fiona, again, thank you very much for really very interesting remarks and comments and answers to the questions. As always, enjoy listening to you. And picking up this last issue, I have a question. Actually, I have many questions, but I'll ask first this one. What is the perception of these multiple Putins today in the United States in terms of a threat, national security threat to the United States? If compared to the Cold War times, Soviet Union was an existential threat for the United States. And given the fact the resources which the United States would marshal and would mobilize together with its allies was far different than whatever we are seeing these days. For example, one of the famous readouts from yesterday's Zoom meeting between Biden and Putin is that Biden originally had said that things we didn't do in 2014, we are prepared to do now. What does it mean? It means that something additional is in the stash, but the United States is not using it. What does it mean? It means that if in case Russia does not invade Ukraine, then these additional sanctions or whatever are in the stash will not be used against Russia, and Russia will continue with its annexation of Crimea, with its manipulation of the situation in Donbass, as it was before. And that means that the sufficiency of the sanctions which are being imposed on Russia at all times is not adequate. For example, I remember in my time when I was in Washington, you were moderating the panel at Brookings with my fellow ambassadors from Ukraine and Moldova, just in the wake of the annexation of Crimea. We were urging that the United States and the collective West should respond to Russia strategically, because whatever at that time or since then, the US was using the sanctions towards Russia, as you see now, it's not insufficient. It's not sufficient, and even more, Russia is dares to think about invading Ukraine. That means that the perception of Russia in the United States is not adequate. I don't mean that the United States should be perceiving Russia as a threat to national security, but whatever caliber threats the United States perceives Russia is not adequate, because Russia continues. I mean, authoritarian Russia, this multiple Putin's Russia, is continuing its policies, which is detrimental to the development agendas of the countries in the region and for the larger region and the world at large. So my question shortly would be: what is the evolution of the perception of Russia in Washington, in DC, and is this the end of this evolution, and Washington thinks that speaks Russia and nothing more, or this is a continuous process that at some point in the future Russia can be perceived as a threat to national security for the United States, meaning that those additional things from that stage will be used against Russia to really deter it.
Look, this is a great way of laying all of this out, Achille. I mean, thank you for laying all of these things out. And of course, there's quite a bit of complexity here, because it's pretty evident that the system threat, or the kind of, the biggest challenge from the US perspective is China. Because in that 30 years since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and especially in the last decade, since the economic crisis of 2008, 2009, the Great Recession, we've seen China basically rise up extraordinarily quickly as the international economic player, the major player, but also as a military power, not just in conventional terms, but now developing a strategic nuclear arsenal that we're watching very closely. So, the United States has been signaling for quite some time, certainly over the last decade, that it's the rise of China that's seen as the big system challenge and threat, in the same way that, we had the Soviet Union back in the old Cold War. Russia threat is not of that same nature as a system challenge, but I think we can see that Russia is actually a threat. It does remain an existential threat in terms of its nuclear arsenal. So, that imperative still to continue with arms control negotiations and looking for new ways of managing that strategic military balance between, the United States and Russia is still an imperative. But of course, as you, pretty much alluding to here, the main threat from Russia is to Europe and European security. However, a massive invasion and occupation of Ukraine would be destabilizing globally, because Ukraine is anything but a small country, 45 million people, largest actually country in landmass on the European continent apart from Russia. So this isn't just kind of, and I don't want to say just to diminish the kind of size of Russia's predation elsewhere or other countries, but this would be of huge import internationally, as Ukraine has also been recognized, not just for the last 30 years as a member of the United Nations. I mean, we remember in the Soviet period that Ukraine and Belarus actually had seats at the United Nations, I mean, in symbolic terms, but they were actually, kind of members of the United Nations body. There was a seat for Ukraine and Belarus there because of the peculiarities of the Soviet constitution. But Ukraine has been, fully fledged member, just like Georgia and everyone else has for the last 30 years of the international community. And the massive invasion and occupation of Ukraine, not just the pulling away of Donbass and the annexation of Crimea, would have huge reverberations. So I think there is a massive threat there, and Russia's putting it out there as that threat. Now, why are they doing that? Precisely because they fear that the United States is no longer paying any attention to them. And they'd also probably fear that China and other countries wouldn't pay attention, that Russia would just be kind of a lesser power, with being eclipsed by the rise of China and not really have anything to bring to the table. And so, part of this posture in Europe, where Russia does have the preponderance of power, the escalation, dominance and advantage, is to signal to everyone else on that global stage, getting back to Stephen's question, that they mean business, that they are a global player. And where can they exert that, example the best? It's in the, the European sphere, particularly against weaker neighbours, or neighbours, that see as kind of more ripe for manipulation, influence, and also coercion. Now, the United States actually proved to be very vulnerable to all of that in 2016. You know, the Russians, this is why I'm saying, you know, again, Georgia needs to clean up its act. We need to clean up our act. I've said many times, I mean, my book is partly about that the biggest risk to the United States right now is its own domestic dysfunction. I mean, we are, and I mean, Stephen, kind of as two people transplanted from the United Kingdom to here, who would have thought that we would actually ever see the United States in this kind of state where we're worried about the future of US democracy? I mean, I don't think we'd have come here if that would be the idea, if we'd have thought we'd see the sights of January 6th, you know, which would be, you know, more, you know, like something we've seen in, let's just say, other settings. Don't want to point fingers, but, you know, this is the kind of thing that you don't expect in, you know, in the United States at all. And that's where we are right now. So that vulnerability, that threat, you know, kind of that Russia brings is also real here in the United States. I think people are really woken up to that. The kind of insidious nature of the Russian threat. It's not just a threat to, you know, satellites or deep sea underwater cables, nuclear and military threat, but it's also the threat to the fabric of our own societies by various interventions, influence operations, hacking and releasing of emails, ransomware attacks, corruption. I mean, you know, we're just as vulnerable to corruption as anyone else is. You know, we need to clean up our act here, there too. A lot of the discussions are about cleaning up our own kleptocracy right now. There's a good book that's just come out by Casey Michael, American Kleptocracy, that kind of lays all of that out, for example. So, you know, there is here a larger point that we do have to kind of pull together in response to this. America's vulnerable too. Joe Biden saw, you know, him for himself, that vulnerability during, you know, the election cycle, 2016 and onwards in 2020. And, you know, one of our problems here is keeping people's perspective focused on that, just as you're laying out here. The tendency is to think that China is the major threat, the systemic challenge, and that Russia is something that can just be ignored. And Russia is saying, absolutely not, you can't ignore us. And the more that we move away from engaging with Russia, this gets a point, you know, that I and others have said before about the predictability of diplomacy with Russia. Engagement is not appeasement. In a way, it's managing a confrontation and a conflict. It's the kind of, you know, the way that the Minsk processes, you know, kind of, or the Minsk group in the case of Nagorno-Karabakh was, you know, very unlikely to reach a peaceful resolution, but was managing the conflict and trying to kind of, you know, keep things on a certain track. That's kind of where we find ourselves with Russia, because Russia will lash out if it feels like it's being ignored. And where will it lash out? Will it lash out in Ukraine, it will lash out in Georgia and on other countries as well. So the United States cannot afford to take its eyes off Russia at any point. And I think, you know, we have to find a way of managing that very difficult confrontation relationship with Russia, the multiple Putins, you know, that I've talked about here, particularly the two, the one in the region and the one, you know, kind of abroad, as well as trying to focus in on the future relationship with China, because Russia's part of that too. Russia's making itself part of that. Russia wants to be part of it. And Russia, just like everybody else, is focused on that challenge and potential threat opportunity of a rising China. So we cannot move away from it. And look, and I think that, you know, when thinking again of advice to Georgia, I mean, which is, you know, what David and the embassy is always doing, is how can Georgia engage on these discussions? How can you engage on discussions in China? How can you engage in discussions on the Black Sea? How can you engage in these larger discussions as a player, as a country that brings something to the table, not just as sort of an object of discussion?
I think unless Ambassador Mikeladze has something to say now, we'll probably, okay, so we'll then move forward with the panel discussion. One last point.
Did Achille want to say something else? I saw you put your hand up there. Did you want to say something else?
No, thank you very much. I was just referring that I will later on.
I understood his gesture.
But Achille is trying to do some, I think, signaling to us here, Mamuka. But you, yeah.
Who?
Sorry, Achille is.
No. I mean, Achille will speak in a moment. I'm not allowed.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Authoritarian moderator.
Yes, authoritarian ruler.
Yeah, very good. Pushing
we
us
need that.
Yeah.
But Fiona, one last point I wanted to make, if you want to comment on that briefly, and then we'll move forward. I think what Putin was doing since Munich conference, and even before that, Stephen mentioned that, is that to bring this conversation about that post-Cold War era security architecture is not fair for Russia. We need to change it. And I need to make everything possible in order to like put all these big players at the table where we can discuss these things, and somehow make sure that the sphere of influences are back to a conversation between big powers. I think he's achieving somewhat.
Sorry, I'm having an unexpected breakthrough of some video call here. I don't know what's going on. Anyway, sorry, I've stopped it.
Yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
That's okay. But I think maybe just 1 minute comment on that. Do you think he's succeeding in actually bringing the other leaders of the world and other big powers to this conversation of like somehow maybe like sphere of influence conversation? I mean, with the China and Turkey and other players involved. So well, do you think that's a...
He's certainly trying. And the thing is, it's his security dilemma, right? What he's trying to do is getting all of us to solve his security dilemma. But everybody else has a security dilemma as well. You know, like getting back to this, the United States is worried about China and its own position and internal problems. Georgia, you know, you have your security dilemmas, which is not just, you know, kind of dealing with Russia. Turkey, for sure, has its own security dilemmas. And now Russia is part of them all over the place. And, you know, kind of you're not going to be, it's all not just going to be on Russia's terms. So that's, you know, kind of part of the issue here. He might engage, but he might not get, you know, what he wants out of it. I mean, I think back to the Russo-Turkish War, you know, the 1870s, for example, when, you know, the conference of powers afterwards didn't do Russia any favors whatsoever. And of course, Russia was aggrieved, you know, for kind of years afterwards. Think about, you know, the Crimean War, the Crimean War, that is, of the 1850s. Nicholas I thought he had some kind of agreement for his own security, and aspirations in the Black Sea, and didn't, and ended up in a massive war. You know, where Britain and others, you know, kind of became major players. You know, you have to be somewhat careful about what you wish for. Yes, he's got everyone's attention, but he wants his security dilemma resolved by others. And everyone has their own security dilemmas and their own perspectives on that. So he's asking us to resolve his security and to, you know, kind of frame things on his terms. And he can open up that discussion and that dialogue in multiple different formats, but he won't necessarily get what he wants out of it.
Fiona, thank you so much. I know you are very, very busy with many, obviously, different engagements from media, for your book presentations and so forth. Thanks for your friendship and interest in Georgian affairs. Thanks for your friendship to continuing friendship in a symbolic way with Ambassador Levan Mikeladze, and to all of us, his friends, and to Georgia, as I said earlier. And we hope to have this conversation continuing in the future. And hopefully at some point we'll be back to in-person meetings and conversation and conferences, and hopefully return to Brookings institution as well one day, and continue conversation there with this group of wonderful speakers, but also many in the audience who are listening to us, and other friends of Georgia and Ambassador Mikeladze and all of us. So thank you so much. You can stay as long as you can. We are going to start now this panel discussion about how Georgia can adapt to new strategic realities in its neighborhood. But thank you very much once again.
No, well, thank you. And I just want to, you know, again, thank Tina and, you know, all of the Mikeladze family, as well as all the sort of friends of Levan, for just the chance to be able to participate in this. It's always an honor and a real pleasure. And of course, you know, I continue to try to engage as much as I possibly can on what's happening in Georgia, and just wish everyone luck. Thank you so much. It's just been really wonderful to engage with everyone. It's always a real pleasure.